Kelly, good to have you on the Valiant Living podcast. This is kind of a big deal for us. We've never had a spouse on a podcast yet, so this could be a tell-all
Without
episode
the other person.
without the other
I feel like
person.
we've
Yeah.
had some spouses, but the other person's been there.
Well, and you're actually a listener of the podcast, which is cool.
Oh yeah, I found it. Actually, I was thinking, I think I found it right before he went out. And I was listening to them in order. And so when I was listening to Michael Denise, I was like, I got to make sure this guy's legit before I know that he's going there. But then I kept bringing it up to all the staff, and they're like, "Oh, you listen to the podcast?" It's like the podcast is getting me through right now. Just like
Oh, that's
feeling
cool.
like I had a window into what was going on. I
Yeah,
remember I dropped him off at the airport, and I was like, I don't know what to do. I had like a 45-minute drive home, and I just turned on a podcast, and it was what I needed to hear that day. So yeah,
that's
I love
awesome.
it. I've got white check marks by all of the all of the ones.
Well, I'm happy to hear that because that's the point of why we do this is because we were talking right before we hit record. I mean, it's a big decision for someone to go and spend 30 days all the way up to some people are there for 9 months. And a lot of times, and this is what we'll get into at some point, but especially the spouses are kind of like, well, my husband just went there and a lot of times there's just no contact. I mean, it's just like, I hope that it's a good spot. So hopefully by getting to know some of the staff and some of the modalities, and then now some of the Valiant victories and also some of the spouses, it'll be a helpful resource for people who are considering all that. And I told you before we started recording, but I love your husband and I have become friends. It's actually funny because he heard my voice when I was visiting Valiant and he recognized my voice from the podcast. And he said something like, before he even saw me, he was like, "Oh, you're the guy from the podcast." But we immediately hit it off and became really good buddies. And so I just think the world of your
Yeah,
husband. He's a good dude. Good dude.
he is.
Well, you ready? Let's just dive in. Let's get
Go.
into this. I want to hear the story because I know Michael, but I haven't heard your version of the story, your side of the story. And that's really what we want to pull out today is what is it like on the other side of, a guy is getting help, he's trying to get healthy. And sometimes it's the lowest moment of their life. I mean, they're just struggling, but our spouses are also going through significant trauma as well. And I think sometimes in addiction, it's like we got our foot in a bear trap and we can only focus on ourselves and getting healthy, but there's a whole nother party who is suffering and struggling and trying to keep life moving at home and all those
Yeah.
things. Let's just start at the beginning. What initially led your husband to seek treatment at Valiant?
Yeah, this question, when I skimmed them all, I was like, "Oh, that'll be easy." And then it ended up being the hardest question for me because I was like, "How do you answer this without like giving credit where credit is due?" Like there just was so much that
Mm,
led up to him going there. So I mean, the shortest answer was a whole lot of prayer and like down on my knees moments of thinking like this is rock bottom. There probably were like, I don't know, 5 times I thought this is rock bottom. And we never knew until he was on the other side that, like, that actually was finally it. But there were so many times where I just I don't know. You talk about, the spouse going through the trauma too. I'll get more to that later, but it's like, I had no idea. Like, I knew I was consumed in it, but I had no idea what it affected until
mm,
I was able to start my healing process. But going out there, so like eagle eye view of it, I think there were just so many levels of things affecting him. Like he had his addiction of gambling, he had family trauma, he had so many things that we were just trying to like fix this or fix this or fix this. And we were talking with his psychiatrist. I had been going to sessions with him for a while.
mhm,
Um, and a psychiatrist had introduced the idea of maybe a more intensive treatment, but didn't really feel like we were there yet. And then a couple months later, I just was seeing things at home where he was unrecognizable to me. And the way it was just affecting every single day and every single person in our family. We have 2 young kids, they're 5 and 3. And just the way that it was affecting them in, like, a roundabout way. Obviously, they had no idea what was going on, but I just realized, like, we cannot keep up with this, and then my therapist, so at the time, I had, like, a therapist I utilized for a few sessions, and he really I didn't connect great with this therapist, but the one thing he did do was, like, wake me up to realizing, like, you have to be okay with temporarily being really uncomfortable and, like, upsetting him to be able to have a different, like, a change to this story. Because if you don't do that, there's gonna be no change.
Wow.
So leading up to it, there were so many, conversations that I had to have with people, get people on board with, there were probably, I don't know, like, 3 people close to him that I had to really get on board with this because I knew once we put things into motion, um, he would need to go to them and get their approval. So I
I
had a
mean,
lot
just
of
for, like,
behind the scenes.
support, like, just to be like, "This is what needs to happen." So you almost had to build, like, an intervention team in some ways, sounds like, right?
Yeah, and I knew this wouldn't be a sit down intervention, but it was almost like, so I reached out to a psychiatrist. I was like, it's time, things are getting really bad. And mentally, like his mental, so in gambling addiction particularly, they have the highest rate of suicide. And so it was getting to a point where, yes, the gambling was awful. Yes, there were so many other things at play, um, going on with him, but I was at the point where I was like, I don't know how much longer this is gonna go on before I lose him. So that fear in me really
Mhm.
was welling up.
Wow.
And so one was a close friend that she saw everything that I saw. Like she knows so much about him, and she was at her house actually a week before he left, and she looked at me at one point and was like, "He is not, like, who is this?" We just could not recognize him. And
So
you know
how
my
I'm curious, yeah, how was he showing up? Was it like a depression? Was it 'cause the only reason I'm asking is because I bet there's other spouses listening saying, "Oh my gosh, like, I'm seeing this happen." So, can you describe it? Like, how that or was it just he's just off, it just wasn't him?
I mean, for probably a year or 2, he was depressed. He was controlled by his drug of choice. But let's see, he went out to Valiant in March. Probably around November is when things really he became unrecognizable. So I feel like prior to November and for years, probably like 5 years, it was a battle. It was something he was battling with. But I felt him somewhat fighting that battle. He would have moments for, obviously, the addiction took over and he didn't really try to fight the battle, but there were a lot of things he was trying to do. Well, then probably around November is when, like, relationships with people he loved, like the kids with me, it was like nothing else mattered to him. But and it wasn't even like, but nothing else mattered but his addiction, but it was like nothing else mattered, even his mental health. So he would come
Mhm,
home and he would go lay up in the bed. He wouldn't help with dinner. He wouldn't help with the kids. Like he just that was the depression. The depression was really putting him in a hole.
mhm,
But then when he wasn't depressed and he wasn't in active addiction, he still was just a shell of himself. You could see on his face, that he just was not his
mm,
normal self.
interesting, just kinda numbed out.
Yeah. And then, like, tapping into other substances, I've learned a lot about, like, uh, when you need escalation and more of whatever that drug of choice may be in different ways and different amount. Like, there's just so different things. You're tapping into other types of addictions. Like, it had turned into that too. And I hear that in a lot of other, um, spouses of like, yeah, they may say that this is their drug of choice, but I started to see all of
Yeah.
these other things coming into play.
Yeah, it's one thing Valiant teaches us, while we're there is about the co-addictions and about and why it's so important for us to try to get to the root of whatever it is because, as you know, I mean, so many people go back to rehab for a different thing.
Mhm.
that go in for one thing and have to go back for another because if you don't get down to the source, that anxiety, fear, lonely, whatever it is, it's got to come out somewhere, and it's gonna, you can, you know, fix one thing, but then it's gonna, and so I think that's really important for you to say that. And it's something to realize is that a lot of times when it's getting to that breaking point, those co-addictions start showing up. It could be alcohol, it could be sexual addiction, whatever it might be. Did you know when did you know that he was struggling with his particular drug of choice? When did that become known to you, or were you just like something's wrong, but I don't know what it is?
I knew I knew for a long time. I'm trying to think, like, I will say it started out as something that was, it's entertainment. And it's something that we did bond over even when we were dating. We would go to casinos together and that was a fun thing. At
Mhm,
that point, I did not know that it was an addiction. But I mean, it had been at least 5 years before he went out to Valiant that I knew it had turned to that. It was affecting our day-to-day finances, and my day-to-day, like, stressors. And,
mhm,
when I look back at my trauma, there's things, big life moments that happened that I felt we were robbed of what those moments should have been because of it, and
mm,
that's 5, 6 years ago.
wow. So walk us through just that moment where you were like, so it sounds like you knew he needed to go somewhere before he did. Were you kind of, for lack of a better term, were you kind of orchestrating this? Were you the one that kind of came to that conclusion? You need help. We need to get you somewhere. And kind of walk us through that process. How did that conversation go? And what was it like trying to get him to agree to get help?
Yeah, so like I said, his psychiatrist introduced the idea. When he first introduced it, we were in the session together, and Michael was asking really good questions, and he was recognizing that this is a bigger deal. And I think for him and for a lot of the guys that I've talked to, the partners at Valiant, it's not just like a one thing, like I need to fix this and I'm good, check it off the box. Like for him, there just were so many moving parts. And he had been at that psychiatrist for years and we love him. He's great, but it wasn't working.
Mm,
He gave us a couple real tangible things to try to do, and those weren't working. Um, so yeah, I knew that he needed more. And then when we left the session, I brought it up to Michael a day or two later, which was very typical of like session feeling good, and then a couple
mm,
days later, everything just straight over his head. Which was it was really hard to, like, have that whiplash from him of, like, "Oh, I have a little bit," and that's how it was for a long time of,
mm,
like, I have a little bit of hope. He said something or he wants to get out of this, and then the next thing I know, I'm like, "Was that not real? Like, what was that?"
mhm.
So he was in up until 24 hours before he got on a plane, I would say, he was definitely not ever gonna go to a residential treatment. It just was not an option.
Really?
Um, not at all. So I got a few other people on board. I brought it up to him the night that our friend was over, and he just left the room. He was so fed up that I bring it up. And this is where for me, I was like, okay, I need to pump the brakes. I need to stop forcing it. But I couldn't. Like I just was like, he's either going to lose his life over this, or I have to, because I'm a people pleaser and I didn't want to upset him. And I didn't want to have to live in that every day if I was upsetting him. But I told one of my friends, I was like, "I'm praying he gets on the plane by Friday," and he was on a plane on, like, Wednesday.
Wow.
But, 24 hours before, I was like, "It's not happening. It's never going to happen. He's never gonna go." So then, how I found Valiant particularly was interesting because when we were talking to a psychiatrist, he was, um with gambling, it's still kind of a newer thing that people are
Yeah.
starting to like build up programs for. So you're really limited. I think there's like six in the US. And I mean, I've spent so much time researching and researching things, and none of them felt like they were the right fit. So then I started, and the psychiatrist even agreed maybe that little niche wasn't going to be
Mm,
enough for him or exactly what he needed. And then I was thinking like a men's program. So I actually was looking up men's programs, knew nothing about Valiant, and found a program in Texas. And they had like a little blurb on their website about gambling. And so a chat box popped up and it said, "How can we help you today?" And I was like, "Hey, do you help with this?" And they were like, "No, we actually don't focus on that, but here's a number of a place that does." So I was like, "Okay," called that number, and it was Michael Deneen's cell phone number, which I thought was weird. Like, I thought I was going to be talking to a admissions person or
Right.
something.
Like a
It's
secretary or
yeah.
something, yeah.
And at the time, even when I called him, I left him a voicemail and then he called me back. I had no idea that that's who I was calling. And so,
It's
and to
amazing.
this day, I've tried to find the website of the place in Texas. I can't find it. Like,
No
I've
way.
looked back at computer history. Like, Danae was like, "So how, who?" And I'm like, "I don't know." So I actually had
Wow.
probably like an hour conversation with him of just honestly, the conversation with him is what sealed the deal of me knowing that I have to do this and I have to do this now. Um, and so I felt like something about my conversation with him just fueled me to go full stream ahead.
Mhm.
And and so then I took a bunch of notes from that call and I told Michael about it. And then he was like, "Nope, don't even bring this up to me." And then the next morning he got up and he was like, "I don't want to go to work today." And I said, "Do you have to go to work today?" And then he just went back to bed. And then he texted me and said, "So what's that place you called?" And I
Mm.
gave him my notes. And then that day we had lunch with a friend and then we called Denning in the car and talked to him on the phone together. And then we decided Wednesday to be on a plane. So it
Wow.
still feels like there was just so much like divine intervention in that whole
Yeah.
process.
Yeah, I got goosebumps when you're telling that story because it's just I even look back on my own story and all the little things that had to come together to get us to where we needed to be and get to the right place, and, I think that's it's so powerful. I mean, it's like, I totally agree with you, the divine intervention, like, there's something bigger than us at play and at work to get us where we need to be.
Mhm.
So, walk us through that next. So, you get Michael on a plane, he's heading off to treatment, and this is kinda where I wanna get to the kinda meat of the story because I wanna know what it feels like to be in your shoes, post you drop your husband off, he's gone, you're like, "I hope this is the right spot, I hope," but you probably don't know tons of, like, what he's gonna be doing,
Mhm.
and I don't know what all you knew, and I know Michael probably filled you in, as much as he could, um, but what was that like for you?
Honestly, I'll get back to this and I hate to use this word, but I felt like my job was done. I felt a huge relief. I was like, I'm not responsible for him and he is it's weird because I didn't know anything about the people. But I was like, "He's in good hands." I had to
Mhm.
trust it because at that point, anything was better than me having to manage this myself. So I was really, truly just glad looking back now, knowing what I know, it is amazing that Valiant is where he ended up and not some other recovery places. But yeah, I just had to trust it. Like I said, I was listening to the podcast like crazy at that point in time. Um, but then what was a little disheartening was so we told Michael it's funny, I listened to other podcasts and people are like, I thought 30 days and it turned into 90. We told him 2 weeks. We were like,
Oh,
just give it
really?
2 weeks. Yeah. And I did not I think maybe Deneen at one point had said on the call with him, like, yeah, it could end up being like 30 days or a little more, but I was like, just 2 weeks. You just go 2 weeks.
Yeah,
Which in hindsight, don't say that to anybody because then
right,
you put a timeline in their head and you don't want to do that. But
right, right.
um, I just said it'll be short. You just gotta go. Um, and so I thought he's gonna get out there. He's gonna be sold on this right away. It's gonna be fine, and I'm good. Like that's it. Well, that did happen, but the first week or two were just horrible. And again, this is one of those things I think I said before. Like Michael has a very hard time talking about this and reliving it because it was rough. So he gets out there, he does detox. Um, Actually, so he gets on the plane, flies out there. Deneen picked him up, and then he drove him to detox. And he actually called me right after he dropped him off, which was amazing to me that he would call me and, like, fill
Mhm.
me in, but he had already identified and recognized things, like, that's another thing I'll say is there were so many people that I talked to leading up to him going out there that maybe understood aspects of him, but any person I talked to at Valiant in the process, they just understood everything so well. I was
Mhm.
like, "Whoa, you're finally speaking a language that I've been living."
Mhm.
Um, so he dropped him off at detox. Michael actually got moved from detox to PHP on a Saturday, which I actually think due to him, they no longer do that because it was a nightmare. He so at this point they have his phone, but he was getting the house phone somehow and calling me and saying, "I need to leave. I need to get out of here. This isn't where I'm meant to be." It was so the Saturday he got moved was a fire drill. All staff that were on call at the time were calling me. We're having calls with his parents, calls with me, calls with them. It was crazy. But I will say that that is where so I ended up talking to Jill and Dan that day. And like that was the moment that I knew he was in good hands. Like
Mm.
before I had to convince myself of it, but when I was having those conversations with the staff, I was like, he is exactly where
Yeah.
he needs to be. I mean, again, this was a Saturday afternoon, and they were asking me question after question about me, about him, about our family, about his family, my family. Like they were diving in, and as I'm telling them things, they're talking and they're spitting out names like, okay, we need to get him to have lunch with this person. We need to do this. Like
Mhm.
they did anything they could do at the beginning to get him to stay there. We were good for about 24 to 48 hours, and then it happened again that next week where he's like, "I've learned my lesson. You got me out here. You got me out. You gave me the wake up
I'm
call I needed. Like,
I'm good
I'm
now.
good. I'm good. I know what I need. I'll come home. I'll do all these things." Like, he's trying to say the right things. And I felt like a crazy person because I'm like, is it because even then he's telling me things about Valiant that are quote unquote bad, like they do this, they do that, and this isn't
Mhm.
what I need. And I'm like, okay, is this not what he needs? Like all the group therapy. He's like, I don't need group therapy. I need individual therapy. So many things. Again, this is when I'm listening to podcasts and hearing other guys say the same things and laughing about it. I'm like,
Right, right.
it's okay. So at that point, then I did tell him, I was like, "Please just stay a couple more days." And they were like, "Please don't tell him that. Like, you just need to." And I remember hearing you guys talk about loving leverage, and this is where I kn I thought my job was done. I had to use a little bit of loving leverage to get him to stay, but the longer he was there and the better he got acquainted with everybody. There were still parts he didn't like, but he realized, like, these people are onto me. And I think too, like, meeting with Bonnie, meeting with other people, like, that can
Mhm.
understand traumas and past, and they're bringing stuff out of him that he was like, "Okay, it's actually making sense." So, he finally got to a point where he was staying.
I'm so happy that you're sharing this side of it because yeah, we do chuckle. I laugh because I see so much of myself in that story too. And so much the Valiant team is so well equipped to know how to deal with us as we get dysregulated. And I will speak for myself. I don't want to put this on anybody else, but when we're in our addiction like that, we can be so persuasive and so manipulative and so, like you said, this is what Valiant's doing wrong. This is why I shouldn't be here. This whatever, and it's so hard. I would imagine for our loved ones, our spouses, to hold the ground because there
Yeah,
is that love there still, and you're hearing this, and we're really good at we've been really good at gaslighting and manipulating and getting what we want and working the system. And a lot of us buck up against that. It's like the first time we've lost all control. Like we don't have our phone, we don't have our car. We're like living in this place we don't want to be, and we're just totally just and we're like backed into a corner. We come out swinging in the way we know how to survive, which is manipulation.
yeah,
And so many, I think, spouses, partners need to hear what you're saying right now because they're going to probably, I would imagine, 9 out of 10, if not 10 out of 10, have to deal with calls like what you got of this isn't the right place. I need to come home. I need to whatever. And gosh, for you to hold your ground like that, I can't imagine just the courage and the healthy detachment that you were learning at that point of like, I can't save you right now. It's not good for me to rescue you. I have to like lock in because if you would have permission to come home, I bet he would have.
Oh, yeah. That's the only thing that kept him there was because he was like, "I just need to know when I come home, you're not gonna leave me." And, I'm not the ultimatum type
Hmm.
wife. Like, it's really hard for me to do that. Just I don't know, I have a lot of commitment to him. But I all I kept saying was, "I need you to stay. I need you to stay." And, some of the Valiant staff were coaching me a little bit because I just was telling them, like, "This is very hard for me." But I knew that's what I had to do. I had to tap into a part of me that I didn't even know was there.
Yeah.
But, yeah, and, like, a teaser for, future questions we're about to discuss, but, like, you have to do that for yourself. So at the time I was doing it for him. Looking back in hindsight, I had to do that for me because honestly, the time he was out there was such a blessing for me to come down from like all of the survival and trauma that I had gone through that
Mhm.
like there have been spouses that have jumped on our calls and I'm like, "Oh, stick it out. Get them to stay because you need that for yourself."
Yeah, that's so good. So glad you said that. And a lot of times we're so attached, and so in such a codependent relationship because the addiction has created that. Like that's not even anyone's fault. Like the addiction has created this unhealthy dynamic. And what we see a lot of time at Valiant too is a lot of times the spouses are still attached to that person's care and treatment and they can't let go. Whereas what they need to do or they deserve is what you just said. Give yourself the gift of some doing your own work and your own healing because you have been in this, unhealthy dynamic and all that stuff. What were some of the biggest challenges when he was away? What are some of the biggest challenges you faced?
Um, I think the challenges are kind of twofold because they it's like I said, those first 2 weeks were really challenging when it comes to challenging with him. At home, as I said, we have 2 young kids, so I would say, like, the challenge was just the maintenance of the house, cooking meals, mowing the grass, like,
Mhm.
doing every task, but truly, it's like I tell people all the time, like, I feel like that should have been a lot harder than it was, and it really I think it was such a sigh of relief for me to not have to I was constantly like codependency, as you said that. It's like to me, it's in my everyday language now, talking about codependency with anybody and everybody I come in contact with. But before he went out there, I'd like didn't really know much about it. And
Mhm.
every time I read anything about it, like I check every box of codependency. So I was constantly like reading him, reading where he was at, and then like trying to make our whole household conform to that because they say you're only as healthy as your sickest family
Mhm.
member. Like that was us. So truly the challenges were logistical, but really from like myself, it felt it felt good at times. And it's hard to tell Michael that, but it felt really nice to just like I was in control of the mood of our home. Like I just was in control of so much that it was a really welcome relief.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's
I mean, it was hard. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that's hard to hear, but it's important for us to hear because even now as the time of this recording, we just got off an alumni retreat and Michael and I got to spend time together there. And one of my big takeaways from that retreat was I still tend to make myself the center of the universe, my addiction, my ego, my everything else. And realizing that when I'm plucked out of the center of things when I'm unhealthy. Now, when I'm healthy, it's different because I'm showing up and I'm serving all those things, but it is a little bit of our ego blow and reality check of like, hey, things for a lot of our spouses got way easier when we were gone because there wasn't this massive elephant in the room that we're constantly tiptoeing around. Are they okay? But I'm glad you said that because that is it's hard to hear, but it's like, whew, man,
Yeah.
I'm not the center of the universe like my addiction wants me to make me believe, Um, so yeah, I mean that can be tough to hear, but that's a reality check that many of us addicts need to reckon with. Like we're causing trauma and it's making life difficult for the people around us. Is there anything more you were going to say on that? 'Cause I didn't want to interrupt you.
Just like as I feel like I hear this in a lot of other partners too of so a challenge is like coming to terms with everything that happened. You know, you if you know anything about the stages of grief, it's like there's stages to it and it's awesome anytime a new lady jumps on one of our calls. Um you hear like a relief and anger, mad, sad, like you hear all the emotions. And so it was challenging to have to like go through all of those, but once you get to the other side of it, you're like, it's not that challenging. You know,
Mhm,
it is
mhm.
a relief.
Yeah. Something my wife said at dinner last night that I think is really powerful because she's like you and has done a lot of her own work, and she was just talking about how she's learned to be okay. Like, hey, when even when bad things happen or if bad things happen, like it doesn't really matter what it is, she'll grieve and she'll hurt and do those things. But now she has a confidence in like, I know how to be okay in myself and get what I need, which is I think it's part of getting the power back after an addiction has kind of robbed a lot of that, which I think is so key, so important. How did you and Michael stay connected? And how did you stay connected to the Valiant Living program while he was there as far as support system goes?
Yeah, so his primary therapist was Bridget, and I was talking to Bridget one, maybe two times a week. At the beginning, it was a lot more, and then it kind of got down to once a week. Um, so she was really awesome at just kind of giving me updates and some of the secret sauce to Valiant that I don't want to like give away everything if there's people listening, but you talk to one staff member like you're talking to all of them and you know I talking to Bridget was one big thing. Then the support calls I've mentioned. So Jill has her call, and then I forget who leads the other call, but there's two calls for family members once a week. And I haven't been to the other one, but I have heard great things of the people I know that have gone to the other one. But um, so talking to the therapist, talking on those calls to the other spouses, and then Jill is on those calls. Like I talk to Jill, I'm like instantly like, here we go. Everything's going downstream and getting the right people. And so I think that was super helpful. Like just to know that like I don't have to try to like do all these things. Like I can just tell somebody something and then the right things will happen. And then like staying connected to Michael, we actually had like a, you know, what do they call it? Like a blackout period or something.
Yeah, yeah.
So they take took his phone at the beginning, and that's when he was finding ways to still get in contact with me a little bit. But when I wasn't when he didn't have his phone and we weren't talking to each other, he though was FaceTiming the kids.
Okay.
And so that was twice a day, I think. And then he would like try to say some things to me a little bit. And again, this was one of those moments where it was like hard for me to like, you know, I want to talk to him. I don't want to talk to him. I don't want to hurt his feelings. But those calls and the Valiant staff were really good about like, those are for you and the kids. Like, please don't be talking with Kelly. And it sounds harsh. I mean, over and over again, he thought Valiant was turning me against him, and that's not what it was. Like, they were trying to care for me while they were caring for him. So, um, yeah. So I had a little bit of contact with him through those, but and then like through podcasts, I felt like I was connected to Valiant through that too.
Yeah. Well, I'll just touch on that real quick because I think it's so important. But that digital detox that they put, I think now almost everybody does it for at least a couple weeks. That absolutely for me on this side of it, for anyone listening who is bucking against that, that was an absolute like marriage saver for Jamie and I, even though I hated it because it wasn't because they were being mean or cruel or trying to tear us apart. Until I started getting my brain back wired online, the truth of the matter is I was just going to use people if I talked. So they were literally trying to protect our relationship,
Mhm.
protect until I could know how to show up in that relationship. And even the first couple of times we talked, I don't know if this was true for you and Mike, but it was with the therapist. Like I didn't just get to talk to her again. And, you know, because again, we had to learn how to, and we're still learning. We'll always be in that learning of how to communicate again in a way where we're not using each other or codependent. And so That's a great point to bring up, and almost all of us guys fight that. There's something about our phones that we lose it. It's like our access to the outside world or whatever. It's very common, but it's a very important part of our therapeutic process to have some healthy separation so we can come back together at the right time in a healthier way. I'm curious if was there moments that you were uncertain about your relationship, or were you kind of locked in and like I'm going to see this thing through, or what were your emotions around that?
Yeah, I feel like I didn't really question the process. Like I said, when I talked to Jill and Dan on like day 4 or 5 of him being there, I was convinced that this process um was gonna be like it was gonna give him what he needed.
Hmm.
Now, I do think he any question I had was more so on him. Um, and being connected with other spouses that were so at the time when I was doing the calls, there were 2 ladies that their husbands had or ex-husbands, husbands, whatever, had been they were alumni, they had been out for a couple years, then there were some that were in the program with him, and then there were a couple new ones. So it was nice having people
Hmm.
across, like, all ends of the spectrum, and it was probably for me, it was, like, wondering, questioning, like, are his motives genuine? Especially because at first I knew he was just saying the right things to get me to want to let him come home. Um, and this is where we were still in a blackout period. And I love that I was able to talk to Bridget and say, like, okay, how is he coming to these
Hmm.
conclusions? Is it because you're telling him? Is it because do you feel like it's genuine? And like,
Hmm.
um, you know, I there are guys that go through the program that don't really hate to say it, but I feel like don't you're like, you have to want it. So it has to be
Yep.
in their hands. Like
Yep.
Valiant will give you every single tool for your toolbox, but if you're not wanting it,
Hmm.
then so for me it was like a for a long time I felt like Michael was just saying the right things and my questions were like, how genuine is this? But this is where I was so glad that we didn't have contact with each other because one, he could have been playing mind games with me. And even if what he was saying to me was sincere on like week 3,
Yeah.
I'm so glad I didn't hear it because I didn't need to hear it at that time. Like I knew on week 3 he's not coming home soon and I still needed time. So I didn't even want to know like things that were true. And that sounds really heartless, but like the fact that I'm able to say that is huge for me
Hmm.
because prior to him going out there, I don't know if I would have been able to ever say that, but like and Valiant taught me like they advocated for me so well with Mike too, like and they again, they weren't pitting us against each other, but they empowered me and still, like, loved and cared for him, but still gave him, like, the smack in the butt he needed of, like
Hmm.
the and I love that about it. It's not like they're turning us against each other, they're not choosing Kelly's side, like, I think a lot of times he was like, "They're choosing your side." They're not doing that, but they're giving us power that we have lost for so long.
That's so well said. I love that. And is also true is when we start doing the work and showing up, then they start advocating for us as the client too. I
Mm.
remember at one point when they were like, "No, he is ready. He is
Yeah,
at this point." And it's probably difficult because you can't see our progress, but that's why it's so helpful to have the therapists and the case managers and everyone else be like, "No, it's it might have taken him 2 months, but he's ready, he's doing the work, we're seeing the change, and so, yeah, I think being an advocate on both sides, when they need to, like,
yeah,
tell us a thing we don't wanna hear, let us pitch a fit like a little kid and just be like, "Okay, you can pitch your fit, that's fine. That's part
mhm,
of it, part of you working through it," and, and then trusting them of like, "Okay, when we're ready, then they're gonna start bringing us back together." And I've said it a lot, you've probably heard me say it before, but it's like that part was what helped Jamie and I actually heal and come back together. I don't know that we would have been able to stay together if we didn't have 30 to 45 day, however long it was, separation. But because Valiant helped guide that process for us, it did it in a way that allowed us to heal and come back together in a much better way later on. Um, and so, yeah, having them as advocates is huge. I want to switch gears just a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about your personal. You've already mentioned it a little bit, but your personal self care.
Mhm.
Um, because this is big. You mentioned codependency earlier. A lot of spouses, partners, betrayed partners, whatever you want to call them, it's hard to detach while we're in treatment and focus on themselves because their whole life has been just locked in on focusing on the addict part of the relationship. So how are you able to kind of pause, evaluate what you need and start, or were you able to, I don't know, give yourself that self-care and begin to like start working on yourself?
Yeah, um before I could really start my healing process, I had to recognize it for what it was. So Jill told me, "You're a trauma partner." And I'm like, "Whoa, that is way too harsh of a word to use for me. Like, I'm fine. What trauma are you talking about? No." Like,
Right, right, right.
and it almost was like I was trying to be defensive for Michael. Like, he didn't do that to me. But then I like had to do a lot of education for myself. And honestly, like, that's the most of the time that he was gone, yeah, you're maintaining everything at home, so, like, you guys are on a fast track while you're out there, and we're still just, like, at the very beginning of, recognizing what this trauma is, what it means, what it does for us, and we don't have a therapist talking to us daily, explaining everything to us, so it does take initiation on your part to figure out what what do you need to do for yourself,
Mhm,
because I don't know, I sometimes I hate the word self-care, because I think it's like, in my mind it's like, oh, you did your self-care, you checked your box, you should be good to go, and that's not how it is, especially when you're in while they're gone. Yes, you need to do self-care, but that doesn't mean that in 2 hours you're still going to feel refreshed, but you just have to, like,
mhm,
I don't know, just do what you need to do in that day, is what I had to do a lot of times. And so I think for me though, it was accepting my self-care looked a lot more like gaining an understanding for myself that I didn't have before, because so much of it I was his caregiver,
mhm,
and I wasn't, doing things for myself, even though I thought I was not. So I had to come to terms with realizing, like, yeah, there were a lot of things that I thought I was doing. I was doing self-care while he was still home, and I was miserable, but it wasn't the same.
mhm,
So I think that a lot of my recovery though, and let's see, he's been home for a few months now. I would have told you when he was coming home that I was further along in my recovery than or my in my healing process than I actually was. And I learned that. I feel like I learn that every week. The was it last week, the Bridget podcast of talking about the
mhm,
nervous system and the polyvagal and all that. I
mhm,
was like listening to it thinking, this is what's happening to me. And my therapist explained it as like this emotional letdown that you have. So
mhm.
yeah, I thought, oh, I'm healing, I'm getting better, but gosh, my body reminds me frequently, like, no, you're still really at the beginning of this, and
Yeah.
I can see that, Michael. There are times where I'm like, you had a lot more healing than I did.
Mhm. Well, and I think that's an important point, right? Because we go to this, 90-day, and again, I say 90, sometimes it's a lot more for guys, but you know what they need, but it's a boot camp. I mean, we're living in this every day, getting a lot of knowledge, I mean, this is our whole world. Well, the people that we've left behind back home, they're not at the same pace, in a lot of ways that we are. And there's still, so I remember for me, I came home from Valiant and I was like, man, I feel great. 90 days. I mean, to me, it felt like a lot longer because I was immersed in it. I was like, that's really 3 months from when a major trauma happened for most of the people that I love. It's not like it feels like it just happened. And I feel like, man, I've been gone so long.
Yeah.
And I think there's a bit of empathy we have to have as we transition home of like, hey, we're all healing at different paces and to maintain a curiosity around, hey, where are you in this and how can I show up for you in this? And then, I think all that's important. Could you talk a little bit about that transition? So he does, how long did he end up staying? It wasn't 2.
Right around 90 days. Yeah.
All right, so 2 weeks turned into 90 days,
Mhm.
and,
Yeah.
and, then he comes home. Talk about that. That
Yeah. Well, I will say when he came home, I thought I would have this feeling of like we did it, we've arrived,
Yeah.
things are, and I have so much gratitude for the person he is today. Like
Mhm.
it is leaps and bounds from the person that left in March. So I don't want to discredit any of that because there were so many times where I was like, wow, like this is, you're actually showing up. And I was shocked. But there also have been tons of reminders that we have to continue to do a lot of hard work. And like I said, it was almost easier when he was out there because I didn't have to do the hard us work that I now have to do frequently, and for him too. But like when he came home, so his emotional state before he left was either all the way up here, he was like on a high, or he was down in the dumps. Like, but I knew what he was going to be. Like, I knew he was in a good mood. I knew he was in a bad mood. But when he came home, he just was like, here. And I'm like, whoa, I don't know how to read this. And I was like, he was like, you don't know how to read my emotions. I'm like, well, no, because all I got before was really high or really low. And I knew what that was. So like, even if I hated that, I knew it and it was
Predictable,
predictable.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so then when he came home, I just realized I have to be in tune with him. And for the first time, like I also had to let him be in tune with me because he had stopped caring for me. And again, this is something I didn't even realize. But like, I mean, I knew he wasn't really interested. Like he wasn't asking me questions about me. But when he came home, I was like, you're doing this to check a box. Like I had to
Mm.
realize that things were real, and I just still am trying to work through that of, and I think, it's gonna take like a year or two to go through like seasons of life to really realize like how real it is. Um, but like now, we have this partnership. So before, like I said, I was his caretaker, and I have to learn to like let him be a partner in our family, a partner for me.
Yeah.
um so yeah, we're learning a lot together, and we have to be constantly reminding ourselves to be in communication. I think the first 2 months we were solid at a lot of things, and now we're like finding those weak spots where we need to learn, where we need to step things up.
Yeah. Well, and then life starts happening again. It's like you kind of come home and you're in this euphoric, whatever. And then all of a sudden you realize, hey, these things that I've escaped from or to for most of my life, they didn't just magically disappear.
Mhm.
And now I've got tools. I mean, I've got tools I can use and I know what to do with them. And I don't have to go back to those unhealthy escapes and I can stay sober and do all those things. But it doesn't mean that I don't still have those same things that I'm wrestling and tensions and, it definitely feels clunky in the beginning. I mean, I feel like I'm 2 years, a little over 2 years, and it feels, super clunky still. Like I'm learning how to walk again and learning how to show up in life. And there's those moments where I definitely feel like I slip backwards and, but something you said earlier when you talk about like self-care, there's like first there's a self-awareness. Like it's being able to like identify and name what's going on in me and then be able to say, "Hey, I think this is why I'm this way." And then I can kind of get out in front of it. Before I could never name it, or even like you were saying, before I got my power, before I even could care for myself, I wasn't even thinking about myself. I didn't even know what I needed, and
Yeah.
so, yeah, it's the transition home is definitely, and I think my ego part is like you're hoping for a ribbon and a banner and balloons and walk through the door and everyone's happy to see you. It's like, well, it's like now the work begins. It's almost like Valiant gets you back to like the starting line, ground
Oh
zero
yeah.
in some ways. And now, okay, now it's time to really start living in, the difference between sobriety and recovery. Okay, you're sober now,
Mhm.
great, but now it's time to live in recovery, get back what you lost.
Yeah.
This is so helpful. I feel like this should be like a 4 or 5 part series. So I have all these questions I still haven't even got to on here and all this stuff. Um, we talked about transition home. That's great. Was there any moments that you can remember where, I don't know, where there was moments of hope or moments of breakthrough, or I'm just trying to think of how to word it because it really is, it's an ongoing process, ongoing challenge. And I think a lot of times we are looking for that heroic moment. And sometimes when it doesn't happen, we're disappointed. And at the same time, you can see people's growth. You can see, hey, there's things to celebrate, while at the same time there's a long ways to go. But I'm just thinking for people listening or watching that might need a glimmer of hope or breakthrough, or was there a moment where you're like, hey, I think we're going to be okay? Um, Anything like that?
Yeah, I one thing I haven't touched on yet is like this idea, well, I probably have talked about it a lot, just not in this way, but Jill always says like you need to make sure that you are going to be okay, whatever like happens with them, that you are okay.
Yeah.
And it sounds like such a simple thing, but I think I almost had to, like, my therapist, when I started with my therapist once he was out there, she asked me, "So, like, do you wanna stay with him?" And I'm like, "Why is she even asking me this?" Like, "Yeah, I wanna stay with him." Like, hasn't she heard what I've been explaining to her? But I really actually had to get to a point in my mind where I let myself, even though I didn't really want this or believe that, like I said, I'm, like, really committed to Michael, but I had to tell myself, like, if he doesn't put in the work and if he doesn't show up and if he has major, like, if he goes back to the person he was, like, I have to consider that option to know that, okay, I'm gonna be okay. If that happens, I am gonna be okay. And I love about our spouses call is like they're the women that are no longer with their partners that were at Valiant, the women that are like, we all love and care for each other. It's never like a, oh
Hmm.
yeah, I went through that, you got to leave him. Like never. And then the ladies that have left him, like we have such like appreciation for them. And you have to like learn for yourself. Like I just had this breakthrough of learning like about me and knowing like I'm gonna be okay no
Hmm.
matter what happens, and I'm gonna wait and see if what he's saying is genuine. But then for Michael, like a breakthrough with him is I felt like there was a point, it's probably right around the 30-day mark where he finally had a clear mind. Like it took his mind time to detox, and you use that word, but it's not like it's like a word of like clearing his mind, like getting rid of these things where he like, and I used to always tell him like he has this lens of his addiction and like he sees everything through this lens. So it was like whatever your drug of choice is, when you're in that, that is the only way you can ever see yourself and see everybody around you. And like you said, it's that ego mentality of like, oh, this person's talking about me, or like everything is around them and their addiction. And I so at one point, if your spouse is out there long enough and you both agree to it, you go out and visit them. So when I went out to visit him, I, I was always still very skeptical of how real this was. And there was one moment where we went through a drive-through together, and I was sitting in the car with him, and I'm like, I told him, I feel like I'm dating you for the first time again. Like I'm getting to know this new person, and there was still a little bit of me that was guarded of like, this seems too good to be true. And you have to like let yourself kind of, my therapist always tells me you have to be able to like have two camps, and that is okay. Cause I always thought I had to be here, I had to be here. She's like, you can have both, and that's okay. So I let myself be happy and see that he had a clear mind for the first time in years, where it wasn't, and that's what he needed. Like he needed to go away. I don't think had he not gone away, he would have ever, like, he had to cut ties with everybody in his life to be able to see himself for who he is, because he never would have had a breakthrough. He could have done the most intensive treatment in the world here, and it would have never worked.
Right.
Um, but then, yeah, just going out to visit him, I felt like, okay, some of this, I'm gonna let myself believe some of this is real.
Wow. So, kind of that answer kind of leads me into this next question because I think this is something I hear a lot. But how do you deal with just so you hear the stats about relapse and all this different thing? And so, do you have fear of that? How do you deal with that part of it of like, man, how, like, I hope this lasts. I hope this is good. It's like, so for people listening or watching that might be on the other side of it, and they're like, man, I feel like the bottom's always about to drop out at any point. How do you kind of live with that? How do you wrestle through that?
I think you have to play it out in your mind. For a long time, I told myself I don't even want to think about it because I just don't even want to believe that it could happen. Um, I was talking to one of the ladies this week about, hearing another person that's spouse has been out for 2 years go through a major relapse is actually like kind of scary to go through. Hearing them talk about it, but it helps. And this is why I think these groups are so helpful for me. Because you you have to play it out in your mind and think that it could happen. But also like I have this hypervigilance of like being worried about every little thing. And so for me, I've always thought like it's gonna be a slow fade. And I have to try to care for Michael and give him the credit he is due to not let myself like I don't know. We're struggling with this because he thinks he's under a microscope, and I don't want him to be under a microscope, but I also don't want there to be this slow fade back to where he was. And so, there's different forms of relapse. It could be mental relapse, like emotional relapse, different types of things that could start happening that freak me out.
Mhm.
Um, and something that we're figuring out as a couples therapist because I just think that we need a good safe place for us to talk about this together. And yeah, I mean it's a matter of balancing like what types of relapse are we okay with, and are we going to work through together, and it's something that we have to face.
Well, and you know this, but just for people listening, one thing Valiant helps us with as we're transitioning is with a relapse kind of prevention plan. And one of the exercises was helpful for me. I'm sure Michael did it too, but you kind of have your red, green, yellow circles of things that like, hey, if I find myself in, as long as I'm in the green, I'm good. Now here's some yellow, some things that are like I got to be cautious of because this is where I'm slipping. And then the red category is like, man, I'm in danger of relapse if I do this. But those only help if we keep it out in front. Like, if we're
Mhm.
not constantly looking at it, because it's really easy to get fatigued with the whole thing and just be like, "I'm good now, let me just live my life." But you have to work your program every day, every week, whatever that looks like, or you'll find yourself in those red categories and, no one plans necessarily to, like, come out and be like, definitely gonna relapse." I mean, everyone's like, "No, it's not gonna be me, not gonna be me." But if we don't keep that in the forefront, it's I know some guys that they're we don't have that here, but they've got on their fridge. They got their recovery plan on that. And I'm just like, well, that's great because every day, they see it and they're reminded this is what I'm committed to and all those things. You've mentioned this a couple times. There's a call that happens, but just talk about your support systems at Valiant and just in your own life for people that are listening or watching. What are some of the things where you've been able to draw strength from?
Yeah, so that calls every Wednesday. uh I my therapist was like, because I was talking about Michael has the call, he's got the alumni call, I've got a call, we've got kids sports, we've got all this stuff. It just feels like there's so much
Yeah.
stuff that it's hard to fit in. And she's like, if you don't need to do that, you can drop that. And I'm like, no, I need it. But I think what I love about it is it's like a scheduled time for myself to do this. And like when you guys come out, you have so many things that it's like you have to like that recovery plan. You have to be doing these things to help your recovery, but we don't maybe they need to come up with a form of like our healing plan or something
Yeah,
because
it's a
it's
great
like
idea.
they have this recovery plan and I always feel like we're trying to make sure he's getting his stuff in, but then unless I schedule my own types of support and things, like it's not going to happen, especially with young kids. Like it's just life gets really busy. So just as much as they have to prioritize that, we have to prioritize our care and like, the triggers that I've had since he's been home are they come out of nowhere. They're unexpected things that happen. So I think hearing in these support systems of people that have gone through things at
Yeah.
at different stages of things is just really helpful to know like there's nothing wrong with you when you're still struggling with these things, but also keeping in check, like, I think one thing, like, having that call every week does help me feel empowered again. Like, I remember right when he got home, I was like, "Crap, I don't have Valiant to advocate for me anymore." Like, I needed them, and it does keep me in check of, like, advocating for myself and learning how to do that, just, like, knowing those ladies know so much about what we've been through, and they're the easy people to talk to. Like, I have 2 best friends that I know everything and I talk to all the time, but they just don't get it on the same level as the other ladies, so that's where I found a lot of encouragement in that, but
Yeah.
I did have to tap into, like, the easy friendships because things that I think it I've noticed about myself is stuff drains my energy, like, real quickly in this season of life, and
Mm,
so I have to, like, go to, like, the low-hanging fruit to just get what I can get.
yeah. Yeah, and part of it too, as you're talking the alumni program that I know Michael's involved in, that's a big part of our vision behind that too, is to because you mentioned, oh, they're gone, and although Jill still has a way of kicking our butt long distance, after even after the program, she knows how to get to us. But yeah, I mean, I think that's so important for us guys to stay connected. I tell the alumni guys all the time, this is more than just like a fraternity of guys who went through something. This is actually how this connection is what's gonna keep us living in sobriety and recovery and committed and all those things. And so sometimes showing up on a Zoom can feel like, oh man, I don't know if I want to do this today, but it is the very thing that keeps us tethered to our commitments. And I see Michael working that and you're working that, which is just awesome, which gives us hope because it was like, okay, like you said, we don't come out fixed. It's like we come out with tools. Now we can
Mhm.
choose how do we want to use it, and then how are we going to continue to grow and learn and all those things. All right, last question. I've kept you a long time because this has been so helpful. Thank you again for doing this
Yeah.
because my gosh, like the courage to talk about this stuff is I can't even imagine. Um, but if you're sitting down with a spouse or partner and you're just having coffee and you're right on cue, you took a drink of coffee, right? As I said it, that was
Right.
perfect. Like we timed it. Um, what encouragement, what advice would you give for specifically someone who is early on in this, whether they're just noticing things going on or their husband is at Valiant or at in treatment. If you could go back and tell yourself anything, what advice and encouragement would you give?
That's hard. I think you just have to understand to give yourself grace in the survival mode period because but it's also you have to, like, give yourself grace, but also give yourself credit because there were so many things looking back, I can't believe, like, I did what I did, and it didn't I always tell people, I'm like, "I felt like I've been struggling with anxiety post him being home, but I didn't at all prior to him going. While he was there, like, I was good." And it's weird for me because 'cause I'm like, "That was when I was in these, like, survival modes," but it's amazing what your body can do. Um, so I don't know, I still look back and think like, "Oh, I wish I had done that," or, for a lot of it is like, "How did this not happen sooner?" Or
Mm,
I don't know, I sometimes I do think like, I because I wasn't strong enough is what led us to where we are, but I just have a lot of gratitude for our story and what happened, and, like, I kept knowing that there had to be a point where things would change, so I was, like, just holding on to a hope even though I had no idea. Like, even a year ago, if you had told me that Michael would go out to a 90-day program, I would have said, "Not Michael." Like, you're talking about somebody else. Like, there's no way that he would ever. But I mean, I just had to take it one day at a time. But the other thing I'll say is like, our story is not everyone's story. And I don't think that every every couple should stay together. And so like whether it's the spouse listening to this or the guy, like I want I would want the spouse to know like you don't need to stay in that, and like to be a victory for yourself is not to like make your relationship work. Like I am very thankful and have a lot of gratitude that Michael and I are where we're at. And I think it's because he did put in the hard work and I'm putting in the work. It still is a lot of work and it still is really hard. Um, but like I see other people that aren't together anymore and they're both individually doing great. Or one is and one isn't, but it's their choice. So like I think, if your spouse is in Valiant now, you have to like utilize that to advocate for yourself and know like you're gonna have to carve your path wherever it goes. But like you just can't lose sight of yourself in it. And I know like it's hard to say that if your spouse is in active addiction, it's hard to like not lose sight of yourself. And I felt like I did a lot when he was. So like that's what I would maybe like I would beat myself up for it. Looking back, I beat myself up for it, but I was doing the best that I could. So that's what I could do at the time, and I think that that was okay.
That's such a kind and gracious answer. I'm glad you said that because, yeah, I don't want to just say what you just said because you said it perfectly, but not everyone's story is the same. And it's not, like just like we had a therapist that sat down with Jamie and I and just said the same thing. This was post Valiant. Do you guys want to be married? Do you guys want to do that? Like, because it's going to be work, right? And so
Yeah.
like, um, so thank you for having the grace and awareness to kind of extend that to other people because last thing we want is for anybody to feel shame because their story went a different way. That's not what we're going after at all. So, is your dog barking?
Yeah. Okay, he's upstairs. He's good. He's out in the basement.
That's amazing. I saw you laugh. I was like, I think the dog's
Uh,
barking.
you really didn't hear it at first? Oh, it was loud.
No, I didn't hear it. It's funny. I just
Um,
saw you laughing. I was like, I think the dog's barking. Is there anything else before I let you go? I've taken a lot of your time, but this has been incredible for you to share your story. I know it's going to help a lot of people. Is there anything else that you'd want to share?
oh gosh. I don't know. I feel like we covered a lot of things.
Mm,
Uh, yeah, I just have so much appreciation for Valiant and even my therapist has said to me she appreciates so much that they do care for the whole family unit. And I'm like saying the same thing over and over, but like they care about you whether you are with your partner or not. Like obviously that would be best case. That would be a beautiful thing, but also the most wonderful thing for yourself might be that you get your healing and you move on. Like I know other people in my life that are not connected to Valiant that I'm like they're struggling with similar things and it's like you have to care for you and you have to just I don't know that if you're not when you come out of this that you are going to be okay whether you are with them or not because they have to make their decisions. And I mean I also think like we are still really early in on this. I have said I have so much gratitude for where we're at, but I'm excited to see where we're at like a year or two from now too because I think right now we're still having to put in a lot of work. And I've heard people say like it gets you're always putting in the work, but it gets a little bit easier. So it's you just have to appreciate the season for what you're in right now and get what you can get out of it.